Is competition a good motivating force? Why are some people more competitive than others? Is being competitive a virtue or a vice? And can it be compatible with living a life of high ideals? Join us as we discuss these questions and others. I'm Rashad Bader, along with Dr. Kevin Majors, and this is The Golden Hour. Welcome to another episode of The Golden Hour. This is Rashad. I'm here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, great to see you again.
Hey, Rashad. Great to have you back too.
Thanks so much. So, Kevin, my wife and I have been watching this documentary on Netflix. It's the Formula One documentary. I think it's called Drive to Survive. And I've been meaning to talk to you about it for some time now. The Formula One offers this really fun microcosm of sort of flow and high performance, and it's just generally fun. It's expletive laden, so if anyone wants to go watch it, just be forewarned with some of the language that's used. But it's a fun documentary. One of the things that's the unifying thread in the plot is this tremendous competitive drive between the drivers, between the team principals, between the CEOs, so on and so forth. And they use this competitive drive to achieve tremendous things. And so what I wanted to talk to you about and what I wanted to ask you is having a competitive drive a good motivator?
Yeah, Rashad, that's a great question. I think competitive drive is often misunderstood as being a purely negative thing, as if being competitive is something that we have to continually repent of, or noticing others' performance. People can think that just noticing how others are performing and then putting yourself in somehow in relation, like stacking yourself against that in some way to see how do I line up, as if that's something inherently bad. Just last week, there was an experiment. It was in mice, but it came out of Mass General here at Harvard, and they were able to locate this unique set of neurons in the anterior cingulate of the mice that is where their competitive drive is essentially located. So that when you could tell by the activity of these neurons how intensely a mouse would perform in a competitive game, you could say. There's a foraging game. How you can tell how well they're going to perform in advance based on essentially where they were computing themselves to be within a pecking order. And so if they were surrounded by people lower on the pecking order than them, they would always tend to outperform them. And you'd see it all mediated by these neurons in the anterior cingulate, which they could even modulate in the experiment and turn them up higher, and then they would outperform people that used to be higher than them. So it's I just cite that one. It's really fascinating. It was just in Nature last week. If you want to look it up, about competition and competitive drive in mice. But the reason I liked it is that it just shows that to some degree, being competitive is hardwired into us. It is part of at least the mammalian brain. That these social comparisons necessarily take place. So just the fact that you have compared yourself to others is a natural phenomenon of the human brain, and there is really nothing that we can do about it. But it's neither good nor bad. So the question is, what does it do to you then and to your performance? Like when you're surrounded by people who perform really well, better than you, what does that then do to you? That's the interesting human thing, that we can have some kind of freedom with regard to the system inside of us. But the system for competition is just inherent. It's natural.
That's amazing. It goes back to this idea, too, that performance is a lot of mindset, because if they could sort of modulate this nerve bundle up or down, and then that would actually affect the performance of these sort of lab rats, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. And so no doubt people will be wondering, can we do that ourselves? Is there a way that you can use transcranial magnetic stimulation to just get those neurons, and they'll like put you in the hierarchy higher up in it.
Sure.
Probably not. The human brain doesn't really, it resists being tinkered with in the wrong way. Uh, but no doubt we can have internal strategies that harness the competitive drive. I think that that's is just the idea of the drive. Isn't that like something that we see, especially in young people, is often missing? And you kind of wonder, like, how do you get young people, especially in American society, young men, to have a drive for their academic work or for life goals? And I think that that's a gigantic question right now in our culture. What do we do with the underperforming, young men who have like checked out?
Well, we're talking about this sort of anterior cingulate nerve bundle, right? So maybe we could try to apply the optimal work neuroscience framework onto this. So when we talk about reframing, we talk about this top-down neuroscience, we talk about the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And of course, we talk about the anterior cingulate cortex as part of that model as well. So let me turn that question back around at you, Kevin. What does our model have to say about this?
What's interesting is they actually did also try to see in the nature study on mice competition, did the state of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex make a difference? And that's where in humans reframing takes place, and presumably in mice some higher level decision in terms of like, is this something to be approached or avoided takes place. And it didn't actually in the mice make a difference. So this was independent. But you are going to have, no matter what, if it's a real competition, you are going to have your amygdala firing because you're going to need, to some extent, your fight or flight response. And you're going to need the adrenaline that comes. And those aren't totally synonymous, but you want high adrenaline because it's a great performance enhancer. And so when we're facing something that is competitive, we get adrenaline as a result. So that's the drive. The drive, I think, is really adrenaline, and maybe in some deeper degree, testosterone itself. Because we know that the ultimate competition is military warfare. And warfare causes men's testosterone levels to enormously spike. So men in war have this very, very high, they're very competitive, very high testosterone. Maybe that's why the language is bad too. And so you kind of think of the form your documentary. Maybe these things kind of go together, But it's just interesting that there is a drive component that is real, and there are analogous things too with women. It's not exactly going to be the same as in men, but I think by and large, in general, you're going to see the same thing in women. How our kind of neuroanatomy, how we respond. It's not so much the difference between something being deliberate or automatic, which is like a top-down difference in our brains. It seems like it's going to be more about how much is your effort totally invested in the task at hand. So it has much more to do with intensity, which is what we think of with, in general, focus. Being really intensely focused on one task. So I think that that's kind of what results from the competitive drive is an intense focus on attaining a particular goal. But I think that then where the more interesting part comes in with humans is why are we doing it? And are we doing it just as an end in itself, some performance goal? Or do we have some higher level of mastery that is a process goal that we're aiming for? So that's a kind of left brain, right brain distinction. We use the left brain to obtain particular outcomes, but the right brain appreciates certain processes, ways of learning, growing, and practicing, and then your drive ends up serving that. So I think that's for us the goal, to humanize it. Is what's the reason for the competition?
That's right. One of the things that I wanted to ask you while you were talking was, if the competitive drive focuses us, and it focuses us relationally to our competitors, can those competitors then serve as that sort of image of the noble that we talk about, the koan, the Aristotelian koan?
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, Rashad. I think that you can think of your competition, if they're better than you, they're like placeholders for the koan, the image of the beautiful. And so seeing someone else's, and there's studies on this, how do people respond when they are surrounded by people performing better than them? And if you have a kind of Carol Dweck, positive learning mindset, that's a growth mindset that says, bring it on. I want to, like, this is exactly the kind, I love this competition and I love seeing how good people are at it. Then you feel encouraged by people who are better than you because they're showing you how to do it. And you wouldn't necessarily have known. And so they're saving you time in a way that they're saving you effort. So if you can be around someone who is just leagues beyond where you are, that could be seen as an enormous boost. Because like, whoa, now I have someone to learn from. I mean, imagine you've been playing squash, in a small town for years, and and there's a very small pool of people, to play against, and then someone moves in from out of town, and they are just light years beyond you, and you might have been the top, at the top of the town's roster, but in fact, you were all more or less plateaued. Seeing someone so much better than you can kind of get you off the plateau again, so that now you're back climbing a mountain, and you have something, and that person's performance is like the image of the noble, the koan, that then guides you to see how and you can make, take leaps and bounds in your ability to play squash. I think that in general in people's lives, especially when people are in their like late 20s, early 30s, that the biggest danger is plateauing and getting used to the plateau, where there's no more drive. They've kind of succeeded enough at work that they're not really interested or hungry to get better and better. But if you're surrounded by people who are extremely good, I don't think that happens as much.
Well, let me ask you, do you need to have that person from out of town come in and dominate you in squash in order to rekindle the drive? Right? Let's say you are this person in their late 20s, early 30s that's listening to this podcast. Maybe they've gotten into a little bit of a plateau or a comfortable rut. What would you say to them? And they're looking around, and maybe they're just better than their other current competition, whether it's at work or squash court or what have you. How do they rekindle that drive? How do they tap into that competitive spirit?
Yeah, so there needs to be some kind of way of stretching yourself. And competition is just a fundamental human way of structuring that stretch. So that when we have someone who is kind of that we could is close enough proximity, that we can actually learn from that person's performance in an experimental way, not just theoretical, but actually experience how they're doing things. And you get to internalize their way of being. I think that is by far the easiest. And that means looking for people in general in life who are better than you, but not just people better than you professionally or better than you athletically, but better than you spiritually too. Because that's another way of stretching yourself. To be thinking of surrounding yourself with people that give you these patterns, people who actually live ideals, and not just being around people that you're kind of comfortable with at your current level of growth, including your moral growth. So apart from that, I think you can learn from role models that are in the past, and you can look and see what are the people who have, been extremely talented and have. I don't mean just inherently talented, but they had honed their talents to some real pitch of perfection. Or maybe there's even ways where just by studying the principles of something, you could devise a way for yourself to practice. So say you're the squash player in a small town, you could still probably think of ways of drilling yourself so that you would try to be hitting the ball 25 times and it goes exactly back in this one little square, and you just stay there and you're not moving. You just try to make sure it goes 25 times off the front wall and then right back into this little square. And so you could find ways just using principles, of getting better and better. But there has to be some way of stretching yourself. So I think you could find it as solo practice. You could find it. It's easier though. And that's this thing about finding people who are better than you. It saves time. I think that all of this happens much faster when you actually have a living example, that you can interact with. And that's true with people in anything you want to learn in life.
When it comes to, I'm not sure if this latest article spoke to it, but is the competitive drive domain specific? Because you had mentioned in your past set of comments, whether it's professional or athletic or even spiritual, would cultivating a competitive drive or enjoying some natural competition in one space naturally serve to motivate you in another?
Well, there is a lot of literature that speaks to how aiming for mastery differs than aiming for performance. When people who are much better than you compete against you, that if you're performance oriented or outcome oriented, then you could experience their exceeding you as something that is humiliating and that would harm your sense of self-esteem or self-worth. So you'd feel like somehow just bad about yourself. But if people are aiming for mastery in things and they want to get better, then they see the comparison, as I've been saying, as something really positive, as a shortcut to learning faster. But that tends to be very specific. The most general way that we have as a concept of like, what if you did that in several different domains? What would you then be? What's the generalized thing that you're building? And that generalized quality is called self-efficacy. So that means that you believe that you basically can get better at things with practice. So I think that is the better alternative to self-esteem. That self-esteem is fragile, and it, can be in some ways thwarted by being around people who are better than you. Whereas self-efficacy is increased every time you get better at something. So I think it's really important for kids growing up that they get good at things. And it might be just one or two things, but and that some of that getting better at things, they experience it also in their own academic performance. To learn how to get really good at something in school, and then use that to generalize the self-efficacy. If they can get good at this, then they can get better at other things too. I remember for me, that was like growing up. I had a wonderful math teacher in 9th grade, and she was very, very demanding, and, I'd basically been a good student, but I hadn't really tried. And there's something about how demanding she was that really clicked for me that, wait a second, this is like a game. And I could, if I really wanted to, I could practice these things in math until I got it perfect, every time. And I did that. And and then my grades in math became perfect. But that was like the aha moment. Mrs. Trumbull was her name. She was awesome. And I went back and told her years later that I have to owe my success to her because that's after that, my grades just became always good. And it wasn't hit or miss anymore because I felt like every class is a competition, not against the other people, but just against like the test itself. And that you can learn how to win at this game. Everything started to feel like a game that was winnable. I think that was like for me how, maybe not to be too autobiographical here, but I think that's how I developed self-efficacy. Is I realized that there are these things that I could get better at if I really tried. And there are plenty of other things I just didn't invest time in getting good at, that I would like to, eventually, but I just haven't done it yet.
I think it totally changes your orientation towards challenge as well, right? We always talk about at Optimal Work how one of our goals is to fundamentally change the way that we relate to challenge and embrace challenge. It stops becoming, like, as you said earlier, that threat, that sort of, if I don't succeed or win here, then it's, a threat against my very nature. Instead, you start becoming more curious as to how can I improve? How can I get better? And so that curiosity, I think, also motivates us.
And people who use, their competitive, the people who excel them as role models, do tend to have, if they fail, they tend to find particular solutions that they're going to work on, rather than just a general sense of discouragement setting in when they don't perform or they somehow lose competition. Instead, they get really focused on what they want to improve in. And so there's something there too that's just very practical, that if you are, it's like it revealed to you a set of muscles you hadn't yet worked on. And now you're excited because you discovered them, and now you have a way of testing them, and you're going to keep doing that now to get them better and better. And it's like learning, I don't know, it's like doing triceps curls. It's a weird kind of exercise, and we're not used to exercising our triceps. But then once you learn how to do it, oh wow, there's a way of practicing this. So you're always then looking for learning, growth, and practice opportunities, which is what keeps us always reframing things then. So that challenges tend to feel doable. But that general sense that challenges are doable and masterable, that's self-efficacy. And I think that in optimal work, that's really kind of what we're teaching people, is this deeper approach. It's like a growth mindset is part of the same thing, but actually loving competition. We talked recently about loving conflict because of all the good that can come out of it. But this is actually a more purely good form where you love the competition because either it's going to, give you a chance to keep your skills honed, or it's going to show you a way of honing them even further.
How would we then take what we discussed, the competitive drive, the desire for self-mastery, all of the great stuff that we discussed, how does that fit into our world of ideals? Are these things ideals, or are they ideals accelerators?
That's a great, yeah, it does seem like so mastery itself is not an ideal. It's a description of a quality that every ideal has. So but it doesn't yet have content to be an ideal that you can I'm just going to imagine mastery in my mind. So, now when it comes to winning in squash, you could imagine this, mastery to some extent, but even then you can break that down into sub skills, and it's really skills that you're talking about mastering. Ideals are all forms of mastery. So no matter what you could be, to be patient is definitely a form of self-mastery. To be temperate and sober and to be cheerful, all of those are ways of mastering ourselves. So how would you use competition when it comes to living ideals? There's, maybe another question: what does it add, and what are you competing against? I would say you're actually competing against the old man. You're competing against your own previous best, but without trying to assess the level of that previous best. So you want to be more cheerful, more interested in others, more generous. And you would never ask the question, absolutely speaking, how generous am I? As if you could. Because that wouldn't be a generous question to ask. And somehow trying to quantify an ideal violates it. The ideal is something that is an end in some way in itself. It's not just like a means to some other end. It's that we somehow are competing against our old way of being. And that's why we're constantly aiming to stretch ourselves in things. So otherwise, competition, if it's not about self-transcendence and meaning your own best, performance, transcending that, if it's not about that, it's going to be about self-satisfaction, where you just get then some kind of ego boost from it. And I think that would be the real danger. And I think that no matter how advanced a person is in any ideal, there's always the risk that they will use comparisons as a way of boosting their ego. So, and I think that it takes a continual practice, actually, of trying to refocus on the stretch itself, and the drive to do that, and having really high role models that far exceed where you are right now. Those kind of anchor us, I think, actually in the positive way of being. Rather than just comparing yourself to people that you can beat. So having these role models that can outbeat you no matter what is extremely useful. So you don't make comparisons for the sake of self-satisfaction.
Wonderful. Kevin, do you have any final parting words?
I think that there is, just as we're talking about this, it becomes clear to me that isn't there something competitive that's in the nature of love itself? Like that when we love, we want to actually give our best. So love leads us to compete with ourselves to give our very best, but also sees the love of the person that you value most, as something always worth winning, not just being resting and possessing it, but always giving your best to win it more and more fully. So I think that there's this aspect of love that even humans, maybe it's all sublimated from where it is in mice, but it still is that there's a good sense of competition, to win the race out of love.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Rashad. Great talking to you here.
We'll see you all next week.
Well, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to check out OptimWork.com for a set of online tools to help you engage challenge in your life. See you next week.